to give you some background, as you may have heard, high levels of trust is usually considered a prerequisite for having a stable democracy. We think that trust means that the system is legitimate, that the citizens consider that the politicians and the political system works as they should. And what we have seen in the last 3 or 4 decades is an increased interest in examining developments in political trust. As this figure shows, we have seen, and especially in the last 2 decades, an explosion in the number of books examining developments in political trusts. And what this discussion has shown is that many have worried over declining levels of political trust. Many have found that trust has been declining, and they argued that as a consequence, legitimacy of democracy is in danger. However, some have countered this by arguing that actually what we can see is not so much a general decline in trust. It is rather, although we can see some countries where there is a decline, for many of these countries, this is actually more like trendless fluctuation. So there's no clear path, no general downward trend, but not either an increase or anything. It's trendless fluctuations that are all over the place. So this is the discussion that we take as our point of departure. We start out by mapping the developments in political trusts in both European and national levels of government in the 27 EU member states and also including the UK. And we have 3 guiding research questions. So we try to identify whether we can see whether there are uniform developments in political trust across all countries, whether we can find clusters of countries where there are similar developments in political trust. And also we examine whether political trust differ between the European and the national level of government. To do this, we may use of the Eurobarometer, but we use a special sort of data where we have a post-harmonized data material across all the countries of interest. We use this since we actually found that although there's been an explosion in the number of survey data available to researchers, actually it was difficult for us to find items, so questions measuring trust at different levels of governance, especially at the local or subnational level, so local regional levels of government. It was very difficult to find questions that actually measured this. So the Eurobarometer was one of the few sources of data that included measures at both the European and national level, but not the subnational level. It was not included, although there is in the Eurobarometer, it was not included in the harmonized version of the data. And this also, we found some problems with missing data in this harmonized Eurobarometer. So we had to complement the Eurobarometer with European Social Survey data as well. So we have tried to get a complete overview of what is possible to map with existing data, but we also acknowledge that there are some limitations simply due to no existing data being around. Right. So what do we find? Well, first of all, I think that it's worth to point out that a lot of the research that has been carried out on political trusts implicitly or explicitly assume that is one-dimensional. So it's basically focused on the national level of trust mainly, and it's assumed that this is unidimensional, so the same developments can be found at different levels. But we actually find that with the harmonized Eurobarometer, there seems to be 2 distinct dimensions of trust. So it is necessary to distinguish between the European and national level of trust. Even if there are correlations between these two levels, it does seem like the developments in trust may differ depending on what level of trust you are looking at. So this is one of our key findings. Secondly, when we examine trust at the European level, we see that there is a lot of variation around the mean. So it's not so that we can say that all the countries. So this figure shows the developments for all the countries included, and also the mean level, which is the darker line. And here you can see that there's really a lot of variation around the mean. So we don't see that all countries show exactly the same pattern. When we group countries into geographical clusters, we can also see that some of these clusters of countries have important similarities. So, for example, in the top left corner, we have the 3 northern countries included, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland, and they have quite stable high levels of trust, whereas in the southern European countries, we see that these countries are affected to a much larger extent by the financial crisis. But we assume, we can't really tell, we don't explain the developments, but it fits it with the timeline at least. But we don't see the same developments in the northern cluster of countries. And finally, but not last but not least, we see that these countries have very different patterns of developments. We see some countries where there are trendless fluctuations. We see some countries where there is a decrease. But importantly, we also see some countries where trust have been increasing, and we see quite a lot of countries where we have had full or partial recovery of trust. So there's been a decline, but it has actually been increasing in the last few years. So the trends and developments is much more heterogeneous than the question of whether it's negative or just trendless fluctuations. There's many more patterns to identify. When we look at the national level, we see even more variation around the mean. So here there's even more going on. We also see greater differences between country clusters. There's simply much larger variation here again. But we still see signs of recovery and even increasing trust in some countries. So again, the patterns are much more diverse than what we would expect based on the discussion that I introduced in the beginning. So, based on this, our conclusions are that, well, first of all, political trust is different when we look at the European and the national level. Trust at the European level seems to be more affected by major events such as the financial crisis, whereas trust at the national level fluctuates much more and there's greater variation across countries. So probably the variation that we see here is much more affected by national events. Also, we see differences, important differences across countries. We can identify clusters of countries with similar developments, so there's no one pattern that fits all of these countries. And as I said, this is not a question of uniform decline, but it's not trendless fluctuations either. There's recovery and there's even positive developments. So these are our main conclusions in the report. Based on this, we make some recommendations. As I said, we had some problems with the data. It was not really as good as we had hoped for when we started this. And we think this is something that we need to address if we want to know what is actually happening with political trust. So we think that the existing survey infrastructure, such as the European Social Survey, should to a much larger extent include questions that measure political trust at different levels. Also, there should be more systematic efforts to facilitate post-harmonization of existing research infrastructures, such as Crises. And also, probably the most important conclusion and also recommendation is that it's necessary to recognize that the problems that exist with political trust differ from country to country. So there's no one solution for all of these countries. It's necessary to actually identify the problems that exist in one country that has problems, to know how to address the issues that exist. There's no one solution for all.